Military strength is the capability to not only protect the state from direct threats. Military strength also helps maintain peace and protects a nation's interests. Historically, many states have used their military advantages to achieve great power status. Of all the forms of power that determine the level of a nation's position, none is more important than military power. A state with a strong military typically enjoys a higher degree of security and stability. Likewise, a state with military advantages has the ability to seize or reduce another nation's power. A powerful military can strengthen diplomacy and increase the likelihood of peaceful settlements, precisely because the possibility of force looms in the diplomatic background. For many states, it was the development of their military power that proved to be the catalyst for their rise to great power status. Conversely, for others, a lack of military power proved to be the undoing of states that were either once great powers or who had the capacity to rise to great power status but failed to do so. Today, there is a great disparity in the level of military power among the world's leading countries. In most areas of military power, the United States is dominant, as it spends more on its armed forces than the next 8 largest military spenders combined. Nevertheless, the United States has learned that, while its armed forces may be able to win almost any battle against rival nations, it's simply not large enough to maintain a dominant military position in multiple areas of the world today. Thus, many nations have pushed to strengthen their military power. One such nation to successfully rise to the level of a regional military power is the State of Israel. I'm your host, Ebube Okoli. Welcome to Up Close and Center. On this episode of Up Close and Center, we will discuss how Israel became a military powerhouse and how African nations can use this as a roadmap. As always, please remember to like, share, subscribe, and hit the notification bell icon so that you will be among the first to know when new content becomes available. Furthermore, if you have any additional analysis on this topic, please feel free to use the comment section. In the past, Israel's military was just a ragtag group of irregulars who would arm themselves with surplus weapons purchased from more powerful states. However, in just 70 years, Israel created one of the world's most powerful militaries. Encircled by enemies since its inception, Israel understood early on that its existence was not guaranteed. Accordingly, Israel had to either innovate or disappear. Therefore, Israel created an indigenous defense industry out of necessity. But the real question is how? How did a nation of less than 10 million become a regional military superpower? Israel's government's first military push began in the 1970s. Prior to that, France had been Israel's primary supplier of weapons. However, due to France's geopolitical calculations, the French state decided to pull its military support. This meant that Israel had just lost its connection to modern weaponry while swimming in a sea of enemies. At the same time, the USSR began pouring massive amounts of sophisticated weaponry into Israel's Arab neighbors. Not surprisingly, a full-scale war broke out. Israel came out the victor, however, the basis for the next conflict was already in production. Additionally, the conflict revealed one of Israel's major weaknesses, which was the fact that Israel's reliance on foreign states for weaponry was going to be a major problem. Therefore, if Israel was to survive, it had to do for self. Consequently, Israeli policymakers transferred a substantial portion of the GDP to military research, more than any other country. Simultaneously, new military units were created and staffed purely based on merit, therein utilizing Israel's best and brightest minds, coming together with the sole aim of indigenous innovation in the field of military technology. At the same time these reforms were being implemented, Israel did something quite unusual for the time. Israel demolished their military bureaucracy. Accordingly, the military was able to swiftly communicate its needs to policymakers, investors, and scientists. To this day, These reforms remain unique to Israel, and they are nearly impossible to replicate because no other nation lives on the edge of destruction. Where African nations have a natural wealth advantage, due to high deposits of natural resources and mineral wealth, which, if deployed properly, can fund any size military. Israel, despite being in the otherwise oil-rich West Asia, is famously low on natural resources. Thus, the underlying factor that accelerated Israel's military advances was American support. Since 1976, Israel has been the largest annual recipient of U.S. foreign assistance. Although Israel had the desire and the need for a strong military, a large part of their success came from judiciously using resources at its disposal for furthering national interests. Unlike many African nations today, in Israel, money meant for military spending is spent on military, with corruption in this sector being ranked very low. Israel became the world's most powerful military force in Western Asia, and one of the most powerful in the entire world through the proper usage of funds meant for the military, innovation, merit-based promotions, realizing that they as a nation couldn't always depend on foreign nations for armament, and using proper geopolitical leverage to maximize relationships with friendly allies in order to properly align themselves militarily to face any geopolitical reality that the future may hold. Israel's military is ranked among the world's top 20 in the latest military strength ranking index by Global Firepower. Israel comes only behind the standard military powerhouses of the United States, Russia, China, India, and the European powers of Germany, the UK, and France. Ironically, even France, who once reluctantly exported arms to Israel, is now enthusiastically importing Israeli military technology. So what can African nations learn from Israel's example? Israel and African nations have many similarities. Firstly, Africa, much like Israel, is a location that has been the theater of constant invasions from outsiders. From the times of antiquity, where ancient Kemet was invaded from the 13th dynasty onwards, up until the current and ongoing scramble for Africa. Africa and her wealth and resources put her at the center of interest for the world's powers then as well as now. Likewise, Israel realized early on that a total dependence on foreign allies for weapons was unwise. Although at least 11 African nations currently produce some of the weapons used by their military and police, many are still reliant on outsiders to furnish them with weapons. The African nations that actually manufacture at least some of their weapons include Nigeria, Ethiopia, Ghana, South Africa, Sudan, Kenya, Egypt, and other parts of the African continent. However, this is merely a drop in the bucket in regards to total expenditure. As such, most of the remaining weapons in Africa are imported from outside of the continent. Official military expenditure in Africa this year stood around $43.6 billion. A majority of this money was spent on foreign armament. Africa's top arms suppliers are China, Russia, the Ukraine, France, and Germany. Thus, Africa's supply of weapons is almost wholly controlled from outside of the continent. Therefore, Africa must address such a security lapse, similar to how Israel developed a serious indigenous defense industry. Lastly, when it comes to transparency in defense spending, African nations consistently rank towards the bottom, meaning that a large portion of money meant for defense expenditure is alleged to end up in the accounts of private individuals, rather than being judiciously spent on military equipment. Furthermore, African nations in aggregate already spend a relatively small amount on defense. For example, the United Kingdom spends around $60 billion annually, an amount greater than all African military expenditure combined. The estimated amount that Africa spends on defense is just around 2.1% of the global expenditure. Accordingly, this amount is far less than certain individual developed nations. Therefore, Africa must root out any and all corruption within their individual defense spending, while simultaneously increasing expenditure, focusing on indigenous innovation. while realizing the geopolitical realities that a nation has to militarily depend wholly on itself for its survival. This concludes our broadcast of Up Close and Center. As always, please remember to like, share, subscribe, and hit the notification bell icon so that you'll be among the first to know when new content becomes available. Furthermore, if you have any additional analysis on this topic, please feel free to use the comment section. Thank you for your time and your commitment to the continent.